Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's conversation on race and policing. My name is Matt Patino. I'm an adjunct instructor of history at Crafton Hills College. I am also a former police officer with the Rialto Police Department here in California. We are very excited today to have Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson here speaking with us on the eve of the release of her new book, We Resist. Before we proceed, though, I would like to take an opportunity to thank the Cal State San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, as well as the Fowl Library. I'll now turn it over to Robbie Madrigal.
Thank you, Matt. My name is Rob Madrigal from the Fowl Library, and I will give the land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University, San Bernardino, sits on the territory and ancestral land the Seminole Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I'll now pass it over to my colleague, Mike German.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School and former FBI agent. I would like to thank Thin Lee and Pamela Crossan for their assistance in producing this webinar and pass it over to my colleague, Amber Broden.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to our race and policing discussion. I serve as an adjunct faculty in the psychology department at both CSU Dominguez Hills as well as San Bernardino with a specialization in legal and forensic psychology. Today, we're very excited to have Ms. Kellie Carter Jackson, a graduate from Howard University and Columbia University, currently chair of Africana Studies, as well as a podcaster and an author. Her first book was Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. And her second book, which is soon to be released, is We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. So thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for being here.
Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be here with you today. Thank you so much to USC San Bernardino. It's really great to be able to share my book with you before it comes out. It'll be out a little less than a month from now. And I just released the book trailer today. I'm all excited. So what I want to do is, with the time that I have with you, is to share with you some of the book, tell you some stories. I'm a storyteller. I'm going to share my screen right now so you can see the cover and all that I have to share. I have some slides. Let me make this big. And display settings. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, and to see one image. Can you nod if you see one image? Okay, good. All right. Okay, let's get started. So I always tell people that I wear a lot of hats. I have like 50 different jobs. I'm a wife and a mom. I'm a podcaster. I do a lot of consultant work. But I mostly like to tell people that as a historian, I am a storyteller. I like telling stories. I like looking at the past and being empowered by the past, especially when I think about the Black past and Black history. That's sort of been my bread and butter, looking at the abolitionist movement, how Black people have defended themselves, how they protected themselves, how they have empowered themselves and resisted white supremacy. And so that's what I want to do today. And I kind of want to start on a personal note. I'm going to tell a personal family story, and then I'm going to tell a story that I share in the book. So this is my great grandmother, Arnesta. And when she was about 9 years old, she stepped on a rusty nail. Not long after, infection began to set in. She likely contracted tetanus, a serious bacterial infection that causes painful muscle spasms and can lead to death if untreated. Her mother was Mary Bullard. This is my great-great-grandmother. Mary Bullard was frantic. Ernesta was her only child, and she was going to lose her if she did not act fast. Mary sent Ernesta to the only doctor she knew, a white man who lived in a big house on the other side of town. The white doctor offered to help, but in exchange, Ernesta would have to live with him and work for his family for the rest of her life. Growing up Black and a girl in 1915 left her vulnerable. In rural Alabama, during one of the worst periods of race relations in America, these were the detestable but predictable terms of engagement. Mary, panic-stricken, not wanting to lose her daughter to death, agreed. But thankfully, Ernesta's grandmother, a former slave, intervened and refused the doctor's proposal. She picked up her ailing granddaughter and took her home. And there she administered every natural remedy at her disposal. Ernesta survived, but for the rest of her life, she walked with the limp. Whatever place she entered, whatever path she took, she was marked by a violent racial imprint. Now, my mother told me this story as a child to explain my great-grandmother's limp, but it was not until I was an adult that I realized that the rusty nail was not the root of her trauma. This story has always gripped me for a couple of reasons. First, Ernesta was a child and her mother's only child. How could a doctor refuse a dying child medical care when it was in his ability to heal her? He had abandoned his oath, first, do no harm. Second, nearly 50 years out of slavery, white folks still felt entitled to Black labor and life in perpetuity. Clearly, everything was transactional to this white doctor. Built into the deal was a lifetime of servitude and likely physical and sexual abuse. White supremacy in America can be summed up by these two diabolical options: live a life in bondage or refuse, and limp. To be Black in America is to live life with a limp. My great-grandmother's outcome had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with power. The power of the white doctor to neglect and attempt to exploit a little Black girl who came to him for help. But my book is not about the white doctor or people like him. In many ways, Refuse is about my great-great-great-great-grandmother's response, her refusal. And I don't have this picture of my great-great-great-grandmother here because we don't have a picture of her. But when I think about what she did to rescue her granddaughter and my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, myself, and even my daughters, I think about the generations that have come after her because of her refusal. Refusal is a forceful no. It is a no that is packed full of energy and meaning. We refuse is similar to Black colloquialisms such as nah or nope, not today, Satan, or my personal favorite, oh, hell no. I think that we have thought about the difference between resistance and refusal for a long time now. For me, resistance is how one responds to white supremacy, but refusal is why. Refusal abhors oppression and insists on defining how humanity should be understood and treated with dignity, respect, and decency. Non-verbally, refusal is a halting hand or a pointing finger waving from side to side or a raised fist. It is a barrier that prevents oppressed people from being consumed. Refusal can be enacted by an individual, but at its heart, refusal is collective, which is why the sentiment behind the phrase, we refuse, persists among subjugated people and is a key refrain in Black feminist politics. Black women have refused to be invisible or small. And my entire book consists of Black people, primarily Black women, refusing lies, violence, theft, mockery, or second-class citizenship. It shows how our refusal denies whiteness and white supremacy, its power, and its unearned authority. Last summer, I took a trip to Ghana, and I traveled to the Gold Coast to visit Elmina, one of the largest slave castles built by the Portuguese. And on a wall, just adjacent to a cell where they kept rebellious slaves, Africans who they left to die a slow death, is a plaque. And on it reads, "We are the children of those who refuse to die." We are the children of those who refuse to die. Yes, Black Americans are the descendants of African warriors and soldiers, but of also ordinary African commoners who refuse to be bound and broken and dehumanized. And since the 17th century, Black history has become a history of refusal. From the moment the slave ships left the coast of Africa for a new world, Black people refused to die. And some even forfeited their lives because they refused to live in the conditions created by their white captors. In the 17th century, Queen Anna Njinga of the Kingdom of Ndogo, present-day Angola, refused the terms and broken treaties of the Portuguese and fought for decades against the enslavement of her people. In the 18th century, people like Elizabeth Freeman, who upon hearing the Declaration of Independence read out loud, refused to be denied her right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As an enslaved person living in Massachusetts, she took to the courts and sued for her freedom and won. In the 19th century, Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 was a collective refusal. During the uprising, enslaved people killed nearly 60 men, women, and children. They killed their enslavers because they refused to be kept in bondage. They killed women and children because they refused to let them perpetuate the system by growing up to become slaveholders. Enslaved people refused to be enslaved even when their efforts to gain freedom failed. And Black children refused as well. During the 1950s and 60s, the American flag was used as a symbol for the civil rights movement. In a sea of Confederate flags all throughout the South, the American flag reminded the nation that Black people were Americans. Here, 5-year-old Anthony was protesting alongside his mother, Miss Eileen Quinn of Macomb, Mississippi, for her right to vote. Turned away from seeing the governor, an officer attempted to snatch Anthony's flag from his hand. His mother called to him, "Anthony, don't let that man take your flag. Anthony, don't let that man take your flag." These are the stories of Black women, men, and children who refused white supremacy. We Refuse offers a fundamental shift in how we understand and talk about Black people's responses to white supremacy. Often Black women are up against white violence, and often Black women are up against a society that presents them with two options. Are you going to be violent? Or are you going to be nonviolent? Those have become like sort of the staple of the movement. Are you going to be like King, or are you going to be like Malcolm X? People ask all the time, are you going to burn it all down, or are you going to forgive? Like, these become sort of these sort of stereotypical narratives, mantras that we hear over and over again. Violence and nonviolence, these become the only choices. And nonviolence to me is based on the principle that one can be morally persuaded or morally persuade the oppressor to have a pang of consciousness or a conviction regarding their wrongness. Nonviolence uses compassion and empathy to compel another's humanity. But I take issue with how the binary of nonviolence and violence has controlled the praxis and narrative by which oppressed people combat their oppression. Nonviolence on its own is not at all expansive enough to rectify the harm caused by racism. And while Ernesto's remedy might fall under the category of nonviolence, since no one was physically harmed by the doctor's proposal, my ancestors' refusal was complex, and it is too reductive to throw it into a pile labeled nonviolence. Furthermore, promoting and celebrating nonviolence as the only acceptable form of resistance is rife with handicaps. My ancestors' refusal was fundamental to her granddaughter's survival. First, she refused the doctor's offer. Then she sought every natural remedy she possessed to stop the infection and heal Ernesto's body. She did not plead or bargain with the doctor. She did not try to convince him that Ernesto was a child or a human. Her refusal, remedy, and protection transcended violence or nonviolence. She took the doctor out of the equation. The doctor had no compassion for the child. He could not be morally persuaded. Violence against him would have been a death sentence for them, but nonviolence would have also ensured my great-grandmother's death. White supremacy and anti-Blackness are always violent. And the constant refrain is for the harm to forgive violence, forget injury, forfeit their agency. We have more than two options. Black people need not choose from a certain death or a life in bondage. We have throughout history approached such violence with an array of responses and refusals. I think for too long, though, our only model has been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And many of King's beliefs have been diluted at best or perverted at worst. American society presents a whitewashed nonviolence that often speaks nothing of white supremacy or capitalism or militarism. And I often find that King's beliefs were not wrong, but merely incomplete. They do not always encompass the full range of human responses that people engage in, particularly in the face of death. King's six principles do not address action steps for the oppressors, only the oppressed. They do not address reparations, which may not be purely monetarily, or how to repair the harm of white supremacy. How do people heal? Not after breaking a bone, stepping on a rusty nail, or after losing a loved one, but after losing a loved one, land, wealth, health, after psychological trauma. And in the spiritual and secular sense, King's principles do not address repentance. What does it look like to turn from the ways of an oppressor? What does it look like to relinquish power? The missing principles are what activists today are still trying to navigate, not how we employ harm for transformation, but how we mitigate harm altogether. Today, nonviolence has dwindled down into marches. When a Black man or woman or child is killed by racial violence, people march. But marches do not keep Black people alive. Marches honor the dead. Marches are public mourning, not public policy. And whenever racial altercations gain traction in the media, pundits and politicians are quick to point to King for the model of doing protests the right way. After racial violence results in the death, the media will question, will the protests be peaceful? And after racial violence, will the protests be peaceful? Or an even more egregious question, does the victim's family forgive the perpetrator? Marches, forgiveness, and peaceful protests are all shorthand for callbacks to King. But nonviolence today means something different than what King intended. Now, it is a performance of passive power that almost ensures that those in power will never structurally change. Moreover, white supremacy does not believe in nonviolence because it does not believe in Black humanity. To white supremacy, nonviolence is a scarecrow. And racists rest like crows on its outstretched arms. Nonviolence alone could never sufficiently frighten or endanger political, economic, or social institutions. So let's talk about violence. Violence is more than the engine of white supremacy. Violence is an entire ecosystem. Violence is a tool to employ, harm, deny, restrict, neglect, separate, and deceive. Notably, it means it has various ends. It can be used to enforce white supremacy to overthrow a government, or violence can be slavery and segregation. Violence is theft and hoarding. Violence is replacing the truth with conspiracy. Violence is rupture and separation. Violence occupies the space of a system, an ideology, a culture, and a language. Violence can take many forms. And Black people spend much of their lives, if not their entire lives, combating, addressing, avoiding, and subverting white violence. Toni Morrison's famous 1975 Portland University speech argued racism is a distraction because it keeps you from doing your work. Literary critic Sandy Alexander argued in 2020 that racism was so distracting, it deprioritized a whole global pandemic. Racism was so bold, so flagrantly murderous, that it has absolutely no qualms about being caught on camera. In fact, it will pose for it. So in my book, what I want to do is look at what I call like these 5 remedies. And I want to focus on how I think Black women have really addressed and been the drivers and sort of the foot soldiers and the leaders of pushing back against white supremacy and responding to it in a particular way. Part of the reason I do this is because of this great quote that comes out of the Combahee River Collective that says, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. And I'm in full agreement with that quote. We Refuse really examines the 5 ways that I think Black women have successfully engaged white supremacy. So those 5 ways I study are revolution, I look at protection, I look at force, I look at flight, and I look at joy. And I readily admit that even these broad categories are not exhaustive. It's not like a catch-all, but in We Refuse, I hope to uncover them as a set of possibilities among many. For me, revolution is about forfeiture. It's about a new beginning. I talk about the Haitian Revolution, but really when I think about revolution, it's about replacing broken systems with better ones, or broken systems with just ones. When I think about protection, I think protection is most often understood through the efforts of the abolitionists and the Underground Railroad and Black people whose friends and families and fugitives forced them to look at how Black people protected one another. I think about force. I think about how Black people and their Second Amendment rights protect them and themselves from people like the Klan, from white terrorists. I look at things like flight, how Black people who left, maybe temporarily or maybe forever, but always in a search of belonging. And then lastly, I look at the potency of joy. For me, joy can be a weapon. I think that the opposite of violence is actually not nonviolence. The opposite of violence in America is the fullness of Black humanity bound together with joy. So my great-great-great-grandmother refused the metaphorical fork in the road. She stomped out a new trail for Ernesta. She rejected dehumanization. Understanding a different path forward means asking different questions and being willing to accept hard solutions. So let's start with asking different questions. Rarely, if ever, are activists asked about the violence of whiteness. The public is more consumed with how Black folks will find liberation only as it relates to nonviolence. Shifting these conversations is imperative. Scholar and activist Angela Davis was asked a similar question by a reporter regarding the use of violence. In 1972, during her incarceration, Davis was filmed for an interview that has become iconic. The journalist asked her, how do you get there? He's talking about freedom or liberation. He says, how do you get there? You get there with confrontation, with violence? She scoffed. Is that the question you're asking? Then she relayed a litany of violent attacks against Black people, from police brutality to the killing of 4 little girls with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, little girls that were friends of Angela Davis and students in her mother's class. She says, when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. We Refuse will not question choices so much as it will examine the intended outcome of those choices. If the goal is safety, then the public should not ask why oppressed people use force, but whether force helped keep them safe. If the goal is citizenship, then it is less important whether Black people drove or flew to another place, and more important that they arrived at a place where they could belong. So with the time I have left, I want to share one of the stories that is in the chapter in my book about a young Black girl who employed the principles that I think include both revolution, protection, force, flight, and joy to combat white supremacy. I want to tell you about a 17-year-old girl named Kellie Johnson, whose bravery compelled her to fight off an angry mob and defend herself. It was 1919, and Black soldiers were returning from war to a red summer. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, he quoted in the Crisis magazine, we return from fighting, we return fighting. During the middle of July, the nation's capital exploded with racial violence. White men began to terrorize Black communities. For 5 days, the city was in chaos regarding the rumored arrest of a Black man accused of raping a white woman. Armed white mobs gathered in Black communities, shot into their windows, pelted rocks at their homes, and pulled Black folks off streetcars to beat them. During the fourth straight night of rioting, a 17-year-old Kellie and her father, Benjamin Johnson, were in their home when the mob came to their neighborhood. Their home was a modest 2-story brick house. Their immediate neighborhood was Black, but they were surrounded by white neighborhoods, and white residents greatly outnumbered the Black ones at the time. Around 1,000 white people stormed the streets, headed toward Black homes such as the Johnsons. Armed with pistols and rifles, the Black community was doing all it could to keep the mob at bay. Sitting in her window overlooking New York Avenue, Kellie took pot shots at the white mob prowling the streets below. She clearly knew how to use a gun and understood the advantage of being higher up. She could see everyone below as well as from a distance, and she had good aim, shooting and hitting one of the white men storming her block. Though police officers were present, no police officer was interested in stopping the white mobs from destroying Black property and harming Black people. In fact, 2 police officers were notified of a person taking shots from a window and pointed at Kellie's home. At this point, Kellie and her father were hiding inside the house under a bed on the 2nd floor. 2 white officers broke down the front door of the Johnson residence and did not identify themselves. The house was dark and quiet. The officers crept up the staircase with their guns ready. They made it up to the 2nd floor and pushed their way into a dark bedroom. As the officers opened the door, shots rang out. Kellie started shooting from under the bed. Bewildered, the officers shot at the walls. Kellie was relentless. She took several shots and hit Officer Harry Wilson twice. He fell to the floor. A bullet struck Kellie in her thigh, and another struck her father, Benjamin, in the shoulder. But they were alive. Officer Wilson was not. When the gunfire finally ceased, the officers dragged Kellie and her father from under the bed and marched them out to the street in handcuffs. The authorities were baffled that a teenage Black girl had committed such an act of forceful armed defense. As people stood around, wondering what might happen next, suddenly it began to rain and then pour. The torrential rain broke the mob's will to continue. So don't be mad, but you're going to have to read my book to find out what happens to Kellie. But what I find equally fascinating in this moment of riot and turmoil and chaos is the way that Black women across the country stand for this teenage girl named Kellie. Everyone knew what she was up against, and immediately funds were raised for Kellie's legal defense. One Southern Black woman wrote a letter to the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, and she praised Black people for fighting back. As she read about the Washington riot, the woman said she wept tears of gladness and madness. Those who knew about Kellie turned her into a folk hero in the Black press. Perhaps the most poignant was a poem written by an 11-year-old girl named Martina Sims. Martina Sims' poem was published in Baltimore's Afro-American, their Black newspaper. And she wrote about the riot, but she singled out Kellie's bravery. She said, "You read about Kellie Johnson, who was only 17. She killed a detective. Wasn't she brave and keen?" And I had to stop. Like, when I saw this, I was like, what 11-year-old girl? It says age 11 years, writing this whole poem about the bravery of Black soldiers. My jaw just dropped. Because in the Black press, Kellie was celebrated. People wrote to Black newspapers to find out ways that they could support her. Ella Rice of the Treasury of New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs wrote a letter to the president of the NAACP in hopes of securing aid for Kellie. Rice noted that Black women held Kellie in high regard and considered the harsh punishment she might face. In Rice's mind, Kellie was a young girl caught up in a horrible situation. She had compassion for her, and this is during an era of respectability politics in the Black community, where it would have been easy to disown Kellie. But at every turn, the Black community showed empathy for her circumstances and admiration for her actions. When the Washington riot ended, it was an anomaly during Red Summer. More white people were killed than Black people. 15 people in total had died. 10 of them were white people, including 2 police officers, one of which was killed by Kellie. So I marvel at this story. I marvel at the courage of a teenage Black girl who was committed to protecting herself, her father, her home, her community. She resisted and refused the violence of white supremacy. And in this example, I think Kellie employed protection and force as a tool, and in doing so, instilled pride and even victorious joy from her people. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides right now and open it up. Oh, I went a little longer than I anticipated. But I wanted to share sort of like a little bit from my introduction and a little bit from this one chapter on force, because to me, it's such a incredible story, both of Kellie's actions, but also even the story about my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother's response to that. I've been thinking a lot about refusal and what it looks like in a practical sense, in a political sense, from an economic sense, from a legal standpoint. And I'm excited to just talk with you about it.
Thank you very much, Kellie. That was really outstanding, and I look forward to reading the book when it comes out. And it's an interesting time for it to come out, of course, when we're seeing campus violence, much like I remember
I know, I could miss
child
the
in the
timing of this book.
1960s. And you know, one of the questions I have is, I think since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the horror of those attacks has created a lexicon around terrorism. And any kind of resistance is labeled terrorism, which automatically delegitimizes it. How much does that force of language and use of language by people who are politically powerful change the nature of the ability to resist?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. And I think that is, in some ways, that it's just spot on, that we have not, part of the narrative around terrorism is a non-white face. That when we think of terrorism, we think of a person of color. We think of someone who's trying to cause harm. And what I do in We Refuse is to really flip that script and say, no, like the face of terrorism is actually white people and white supremacy and white men. And that if we go through, and the New York Times has actually done a whole, and the Anti-Defamation League, I think, has looked at all of these like violent events or either mass shootings and found that like 451 of them, and I might be getting the statistic wrong, was like committed by white men, these terroristic acts. And that when we think about like what the face or who the poster child of terrorism is in America, it's actually not a person of color. And I think that we saw that clear as day on January 6th. And that to me looks like terrorism. But being able to get that narrative to get traction is so difficult. I mean, I remember talking to people and they were saying, oh, it wasn't an insurrection. It was just, you know what? Like, what was it? If it wasn't that, tell me what it was. Like, but I think that narrative is so entrenched that we are so poised to see Black people as perpetrators or Black people as violent, that we have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to sort of flip the script. But that's what I want people to be able to do. And not for a tit for tat, but because that's the reality.
Mhm.
Dr.
My question for
Jackson.
you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Amber.
It's
Go
okay.
ahead.
Go ahead, Matt.
Dr. Jackson, I kind of wanted to maybe drag that point a little bit. How much are we seeing language? Because you kind of alluded to it, kind of the racially coded language, and I think I think to Richard Nixon, who used the phrase "law and order," kind of kind of a willy-nilly phrase, but we knew where he was directing that. How much of that has played into this?
I think a lot. I think language, and not just language, but sort of like shorthand or dog whistles or symbols or other ways that we think about race without saying race has become a way, has become a distraction, is what Toni Morrison would say. And a distraction in the sense that when Black people try to live their lives, they always come up against these barriers because of these ideas and language and narrative that Black people are somehow undeserving, that Black people, like in the case of my grandmother, was not worthy of medical care, that Black people in the case of Washington, D.C. should not be able to defend themselves, to protect themselves from the mob, that everything Black people owned is totally okay for destruction because we don't care about what they have anyways. Like, that's why the riot was able to persist for days. It took really like almost 5 days for the Washington riot to sort of quail. And honestly, had it not rained, it could have gone on much longer because President Wilson waited to send in the troops to stop all of the rioting. So I think language and these ideas about Blackness and whiteness that are so pervasive in our society, I think that's what really keeps people from sort of moving forward and having deeper conversations about how do we get to the root of this and how do we push away the distractions.
Yeah, I guess to piggyback off of that, Dr. Jackson, I really appreciated your conversation and I guess highlighting the aspect that we're both Howard alumni.
Yeah, it's you.
One thing that I wanted to kind of say in reference to what you just shared is, James Baldwin said in 61, and using contemporary language, to be Black in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time. And so based on your, research, going down your ancestry, connecting it to your studies, now teaching within Africana studies, when did your passion really become ignited? What was the onset for all of this research and the passion that you share within your studies now?
I mean, my mom is a professor. She's retired, but she's a college professor, and I felt like I got lectures every day about Black history. And even when I was a child, I was watching Alex Haley's Roots and, like getting that kind of, you gonna learn today, like getting that kind of upbringing. I mean, my mom curated so much of my childhood, everything that I read. I remember reading like Mildred D. Taylor books as a child, and like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and Let the Circle Be Unbroken. These were classic books for me, but they opened up the door to seeing history in a different way. And then of course, going to Howard, you can't attend an HBCU and not sort of be affirmed in your identity. But one of the things I do try to do in this book is to kind of also push back against the James Baldwin quote and to say, like, our entire existence is not rage. There is joy, and joy is a weapon, and joy can be used, and we have to employ it as a tactic against the erosion of white supremacy. And so one of my favorite chapters to write is the last chapter of the book. It is all about how Black people find joy. And what I find is that when you talk about like these moments in history that are incredibly violent or really intense, like Kerry in Washington, D.C., they're just like the Montgomery Brawl, right? Just like there was joy in seeing Black people swing a chair or, swim across to defend someone. There was that same feeling in Washington, D.C., and knowing like might have destroyed our property. They might have got some of us, but not all of us. Like we defended ourselves and we managed to sort of like stand our ground a little bit. And there's joy in that. There were people who were weeping from the tactics of defense that Black men and women took up. So I do think that when we do this work toward liberation, that it doesn't and shouldn't deplete us to the point of depression. Like I do think that there is a joyfulness to Blackness that really does protect us from all the harm of white supremacy.
Thank you for that share.
Mike?
We have, okay.
Should I answer the questions? I see a couple questions in the chat. Do you want me to just tackle them? Okay,
Yeah.
I see. The first question is, how long have you been writing? Forever. Since I started graduate school, I started Columbia I went to Howard and then Columbia University for grad school. Studied under Eric Foner. Took me about 6 years to finish my PhD, and then about another 9 years to finish Force and Freedom, to finish the book. There were a lot of moves and jobs and babies in the midst of that. But my first book took a really long time. I mean, if you count from like grad school to where I finished, or even if you just count from when I finished, it took about 9 years to finish Force and Freedom. This book took about maybe 4. I kept changing it because stuff kept happening. and even now there's stuff I want to put in the book and I'm like, it's too late. But I've been writing for years, and my best practice is I need big chunks of time. Some people can like, in an hour and 30 minutes, they can crank something out. I need like 8 solid hours. And I take very little breaks in between, actually, like maybe to get a snack or use the restroom. But for the most part, I need big chunks of time to write. There's another question that says, the story was amazing. I've never heard it before. I'm craving more. I'm getting to know the end. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much for your kind words. And then that's all I see in the chat. Are there other questions? I see there's another.
Yeah, we do have one in the Q&A.
Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong chat. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's okay, Dr. Jackson. So
how much of the Black struggle occurring now from the lack of a 2-family household? How much is the Black
two-parent, I think, was the met. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not gonna answer in a way that
Yeah.
I think that there is a lot of mythology and some ways might say pathology about the Black family. And what sociologists have found is that single white women, white mothers who are white women who are single and have children make more money than Black people of 2-headed households. So that should like sit with that for a second. Yeah. Which means that you can have a 2-headed household, you can have a single-headed household. The struggle is real regardless. So it is never, I think we have put so much stock in the institution of marriage, which is a very sort of like Western idea, as being the solution to, just get married and you won't have these problems. Not true. I just listened to a podcast about tax season. Tax season, we just passed it, but Black people who are married are taxed at a higher rate than Black people who are not. Like, there are statistics that show over and over again how much marriage is actually not a benefit, the institution itself, the contract itself, to taxes, to your overall economic sort of well-being, and certainly not when it comes to combating white supremacy. Even when you think about Black motherhood and high Black maternal rates, most of those rates are felt among Black middle-class women, Black women who are educated, Venus or Serena Williams is a perfect example of this, of someone who is a billionaire. I guess she's a billionaire. She's not broke, and yet still could have, lost her life in childbirth. Like class and marriage status and some of these things that we think will buffer us from white supremacy actually don't. They might delay, or they might sort of like cushion, but they don't stop the onslaught.
Thank you. I was a little hesitant to ask that question.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, there are no bad questions. There are no bad
questions. I just think that, the Kerner Commission did not find that was a factor in their ultimate decision. So I did kind of want to ask you this time period, because I did not know about the Washington riots of 1919, but interesting that this happened right around the same time as Tulsa.
Yeah,
Could you speak to the time period, maybe?
It did. I mean, part of this is World War I is winding down. Soldiers are returning from war. Black soldiers are returning from war. They're returning home in their uniforms, and Black people are being lynched in their uniforms. The idea that you could wear the uniform, that you could be an American soldier, that you could be off in Europe fighting against, all the evils that be, the powers that be, and you come home emboldened. You come home with your eyes widened, knowing that, segregation is unnecessary. Segregation is violent. And you see a lot of racial unrest all across the country. Red Summer is explosive everywhere. In Chicago, there are riots. Tulsa's 1921, so it's a couple of years after that. But in this period of the late teens and early 20s, racial unrest is almost at a peak. It's what the historian Rayford Logan calls the nadir. He says it's one of the worst racial periods in American history outside of slavery. You had riots in Arkansas. You had riots in Florida. You had riots in even in places like New York City and in Boston, places in the North. There was no sort of geographical space that you could go to where there was not racial unrest. Even if the amount of Black people living in that town was marginal, you had this resentment about Black people that came back emboldened. And DC is so incredible because it was not Chocolate City at that point. The Chocolate City that I know, that I went to Howard in, it was not that in 1919. White people outnumbered Black people vastly, but you had a small growing Black middle class population. You had Black people that had good government jobs, that could afford to put their kids in school and could afford to do well for themselves. And W.E.B. Du Bois says this, he says that like the greatest threat to white supremacy is like Black excellence. Like no one is afraid of like the Black drunkard on the corner, right? Like he's not gonna take your job, but the person who is excelling, the person who's the landowner, the person that has resources, is the one that is the greatest threat. And that is what the soldier proved. The Black soldier coming back from war was Black excellence. And people could not accept that.
And I have a question that I think follows on to that. Red Summer, of course, was all across the country. It wasn't just in DC, and there were major race riots in pretty much every major city.
Yeah.
And yet it's not something that many people know about in the United States. I mean, I remember it was a comic book and a TV show that sort of raised awareness of the Tulsa Massacre, rather than our primary and secondary education system.
Yeah.
And particularly, I love the way you talk about white supremacist violence, not in terms of, the kid with the swastika tattooed on his neck, but rather the systems.
Yes. White supremacy is erasure. So not knowing about Red Summer is intentional, right? It's not just, we don't know how that got left out of the book. That never happened. We just forgot. I tell my students all the time, forgetting is political. Forgetting is political. The country does not just have amnesia. Like there is a specific reason things are not taught, things are left out of the book, and erasure is violence, and erasure is part of white supremacy, because you can't promote whiteness as supreme without also creating a narrative of anti-Blackness. And one of the ways you create a narrative of anti-Blackness is not just showing Black people as deficient or defunct, but never showing them as successful, never showing them as capable, never showing them as human beings. Is part of that narrative too. So I'm always telling my students, like, the work of violence is twofold. It benefits white people, it disadvantages Black people, and it does it in a number of ways. It's not just a one-sided framework. It's a whole system.
And how do you view it seems like at the different points in history, there's progress on civil rights and then a retrenchment of
Yes.
supremacy, and the assaults on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion training now, do you think are part of that same effort to
no
erase?
question. No question. I mean, when I think about, and I take this back to, slavery and Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War, no other place in the Western Hemisphere do you have people who were enslaved becoming senators, becoming elected officials within one generation. I mean, Reconstruction's basically like a dozen years, a little more than 10 years. It's not like within 100 years you get, these elected officials. Within years, you get so much progress all at once. And it's not as though Black people had power, as though they became supreme, but for the first time, Black people had meaningful influence, a say in their politics, a say in their child's education, a say about where they would live or how much money they would make for doing a particular job. And the backlash of that progress, we still live in that backlash, and we see it happen cyclically all the time. Whenever there's a major progress, like say Obama being elected, then there's retrenchment, right? Whenever there's like a law that seems great or something progressive, then another law that's taken away to sort of undermine or eradicate whatever progress has been made. All throughout the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you see it over and over again. And we're seeing it even in our own lifetimes. You see it in Hollywood. There's a Black film renaissance, and then there's no Black films. Then there's another Black film renaissance, and then nothing. Like, we see this in every single field or aspect. You have, multiple Black authors. Oh, it's a Black literature moment, and then nothing. So you see it in the art world, because anytime Black people enter a space, they change it. And I think they change it for the better, but that's me being biased. But like every time they enter a space, they change the recipe. They change the dynamic of that group. And in order for white supremacy to maintain its power structures, it's terribly threatened by that. And so that's why you see it everywhere. It's not just in, policing or in housing or in education. It's everywhere because that is how it works.
Amber, Matt,
I see
Yeah.
another
So,
question.
yeah, here's the next question. It looks like, okay, so it's two parts. I'm learning, but not there yet. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Dr. Jackson. Could you discuss some ways the Great Migration at this time and the Red Summer are related?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in some ways, the violence of white supremacy, specifically in the South, is pushes a lot of Black people to the North. There's these what we call like sort of push-pull factors, where my family is a perfect example of that. My family was Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and then within a generation or two, everyone or half of them are all living in Detroit for the auto industry or Chicago for another industry. I think that whenever you have massive amounts of violence, people leave, people flee. We see that happening all over the world. No one can stay in chaos. No one can live in an existence in which their entire world is being shrunk down to like a 2-block radius. And so one of my chapters is called Flight because it's all about Black people leaving. That this is something that Black people have done, well, from the moment that they've been brought here, but like you will see even during the American Revolution, when war breaks out, Black people leave the plantation in droves. Like the state of Georgia lost 15,000 enslaved people. They left the plantations while people were off fighting the war. There was a proclamation by Lord Dunmore. He's a British sort of soldier, military leader, and he made this proclamation that basically said, hey, Black people, if you fight for the British, we'll give you your freedom. And people are like, we're out. And people left. And some of those people went to Canada, some of them went to Nova Scotia, some of them went to Liberia. You see a great exodus in migration after the Civil War. You see a great exodus in migration, like because of the terrorism in the South, because of the constant lynchings in the South that take place, where basically 2 Black people per week are being lynched. And Black people are like, we're not staying here. You see it in the art world when people like James Baldwin are like, I'm going to Paris and I don't know when I'll come back. Josephine Baker, I'm going to Paris too, and I'm not coming back. There are so many Black people that leave at the turn of the 20th century, leave and go to Haiti, actually. There are Black people that leave and go to Canada. There are Black people that go back to Africa. But one of the things I say about that chapter is that you can leave for a short amount of time, a few weeks, a month, a year. You can leave forever. But leaving is not a solution. Like it doesn't really solve the problem. And one thing that I found, and I have traveled a lot, is that wherever I go, I still find it difficult to be Black. Even if you are in an all Black space, there are still colonial power structures in place that make it difficult to enjoy the place that you're in. And so flight is a temporary solution. And it, for some people, it might be a permanent solution individually, but I'm not looking at the individual. When I talk about liberation, I mean the collective. How do we all get free? I'm not free if you're not free. You're not free if I'm not free. So if we're looking at the collective, flight might work for individuals, but we all can't leave, which means we got to make it work right where we are. And so how do we do that work is kind of what I've been wrestling with my whole life. But that's a really long answer to get to your question. Like, I think, yes, the Great Migration is a response to not just violence, but it's also a response to better opportunities. And I think that that's not just what it's Black people. I think anyone who is stuck will try to leave that situation, geographically, politically, socially, you name it.
We're almost out of time, but I have a question. So we can go back. The voices: Marcus Garvey, Washington, Du Bois. Fast forward: Toni Morrison, Michelle Alexander. We can take a piece, or we can take bits and pieces from all of those voices towards resistance. Does resistance lie with one voice, or does it lie a little bit from each of them?
Everyone. There's no, I mean, you just listed off a whole bunch of like my historical boyfriends and girlfriends. Like all of those people are pretty much all quoted in my book, I'm sure. I quote Toni Morrison a lot. I quote Frederick Douglass a lot. But I think that like I quote James Baldwin and Du Bois a lot. There are some people that I think have a real gift and talent with sort of like capturing the sentiment, the moment, the sort of spirit of what people are going through. But we need all of these minds in order to do the work. Poets cannot save the world on their own. They are absolutely a part of the solution. I will never poo-poo a poet, right? But we can't do it with them alone. We can't just do it with STEM either. Like, and not just the humanities. It takes an all hands on deck approach and as many voices at the table as possible to sort of create the world that we want to live in. No one can be left out. But that's the beauty of inclusion, is that we all get a say and have a stake in the world that we live in.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you. This was so great. Time flew by.
It did.
This was absolutely great. Wonderful, fantastic questions. Like, I really hope you guys get the book and enjoy it and share it with a friend.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.